Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel on governance, crime, and development, addressing the human impacts of scam networks in Southeast Asia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area, and I pay my respects and our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Nathan Shea. I'm the Assistant Director for Conflict and Fragility with the Asia Foundation based in Thailand, Bangkok. And I'm also the Program Manager of the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Program, which some of the research that you'll be hearing about today is from. Some of you may be familiar already, and I hope some of you are already familiar with the scam industries that have been established in mainland Southeast Asia over the last few years. They have, thankfully, in the last 12 months, started to be covered quite extensively in the media, led by some very brave local journalists, but then filtering through into coverage in the New York Times, even 60 Minutes Australia, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. It's really becoming quite a popular topic of coverage. But for those of you who, this might be some of you your first time hearing about it, just a bit of a background. Since particularly 2020, 2021, there has been an explosion in online scam activity in Southeast Asia, including activities which are commonly known as pig butchering scams, where people from across the world are duped online into trading cryptocurrencies and otherwise, and having their life savings pilfered from them through these online networks. The USIP reports that $44 billion a year have been scammed across the Mekong countries of Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia annually, equal to about 40% of the combined formal GDP of these three countries. And in Cambodia, it's about 50% of the country's GDP. But in addition to the victims around the world, there are also victims that have been brought from around the world and trafficked into these scam centers. There are hundreds of thousands of people that have been trafficked into scam centers in the region, including estimates of 120,000 who've been trafficked into Myanmar, that figure coming from an OHCHR report. And these are people from Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaysia, East Asia and Taiwan, South Asia, including India, Pakistan, and Nepal, and as far abroad as Uganda, Kenya, Brazil, and even reports of Westerners who have been trafficked into these centers. And forced to work illegally, forced to work and trafficked to commit crimes and scam people around the world. But in addition to these people who have been brought into the centers, there is also the impact on local communities. There have been villages and towns that have been demolished, and the building of crime towns and compounds and cities that are built on the exploitation of local people, trafficked people, and people overseas. At the Asia Foundation, we come to this issue from our work on conflict. We have led the Cross-Border Local Research Network since 2018, which is a component of the UK-supported Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Program that looks at the dynamics and impacts of conflict in border regions and the transnational networks and connections of conflicts in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. In Myanmar, we've worked with a number of local partners, including investigative journalists, to document the connections between conflict actors, such as armed groups, paramilitary forces, border guard forces, and even the Myanmar military, and their connections with criminal actors and serious organized crime. This has been the case for decades, whether that's crime activity around drug production and trafficking of drugs, the exploitation of precious gems, teak and rare earth minerals. But since the coup in 2021, the political and economic conditions on the ground have driven greater exploitation of these resources and helped support and sustain and build this rampant online scam industry. As our project wraps up next year, we've been pulling together the findings and engaging with like-minded partners in Thailand and the region, across the region, to not only share our knowledge about the intersections between conflict and crime, but also start to work together and work together about in areas about what we can do more for improving regional cooperation and coordination. And that leads me to introducing the excellent panel that we've been able that have kindly joined us here at the Australasian Aid Conference in Canberra. I'm going to run through and introduce all of our speakers first, and then we'll jump to our first speaker. But Professor Pinkeaw Laungaramsri is a professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Chiang University. Her research spans a broad range of topics, including the politics of nature conservation, the rights of upland communities, gender and transnational movements, and cross-border development in the greater Mekong sub-region, with special emphasis on special economic zones in border areas. Apart from teaching and research work, Pinkeaw is also involved in various social and academic activism, and she's a co-founder of Book Republic, an alternative bookstore based in Chiang Mai that hosts talk series and organizes a training on democracy in order to enhance political awareness. Laure Siegel is an investigative journalist who we've been working with at the Age Foundation for the last year, looking at the scam centers along the Thai-Myanmar border. She is the South Asia correspondent for French investigative outlet Mediapart, a media trainer and the co-founder of Visual Rebellion Collective, a platform founded after the military coup for Myanmar reporters, researchers, photographers, artists, and filmmakers to publish their curated work. And Dr. Lucia Pietropaoli, is a team leader at the ASEAN-Australia counter-trafficking program. Dr. Lucia has over 15 years' experience as a public servant, political advisor, and international development professional. She worked for almost 10 years as a diplomat and development professional in Australian DFAT, including as First Secretary of Justice and Democratic Governance and Council of Poverty and Social Development in the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. And she holds a PhD from the University of Melbourne in the field of international relations on human security. So thank you all again for joining us, and I will pass it over to our first presenter, Professor Pinkeaw.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Nathan, for the nice introduction to this topic. The internet scam in Asia has been an issue that is widely covered by media, not just news, but also films and novels. But the phenomenon has not yet been adequately discussed in academic writing. So in this presentation, I propose to conceptualize the internet scam empire in Southeast Asia through the concept of dark somia. Somia is a metaphor that describes a region of Asia where people have not been governed by a nation state. The concept that was used and popularized by the renowned political scientist turned anthropologist James C. Scott in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, an Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. Scott's framework of somia represents both a geographical space on the edge of the powerful state, where the friction of terrain prevents the advancement of the state, and a mode of political practice where various cultural strategies, such as written agriculture, oral communication, and multiple ethnic identifications are deployed to evade state control. However, according to Scott, somia regions sustained their autonomy only until the end of the World War II. After the 1950s, new distance demolition technologies such as road telecommunication employed by the state to bypass hostile terrain and effectively bringing borderland closer to the state, and thus ending the era of the chattel zone and the anarchist spirit of the ethnic Somian. In this presentation, I would like to rethink Scott's somia in the wake of the recent Chinese enclosure in the Burmese current frontier. In the neoliberal era, chattel zones out of reach of the state have even been more pivotal and needed, not only by local dissidents, but especially by nomadic capital-seeking resource prospect outside state intervention. China and its extraterritorial exercise of control over Chinese citizens, diaspora, Minority population, especially members of transnational criminal networks, represent a case in point. Over the past decade, movement and expansion of Chinese-operated online gambling and scamming economy across the Southeast Asian region and forceful measures by the Chinese state to suppress such transnational criminal activities have had an immense impact on borderland in the region. Myanmar's indigenous Somia has increasingly been transformed into and replaced by what I call dark Somia. Dark Somia is both a site and a process of appropriation, a way in which indigenous space have been remade into a foreign other, while the livelihood of people has been radically reconfigured. This kind of Somia remains a site of anarchist terrain and non-state space, but the people of Dark Somia are no longer marginalized ethnic minorities. These runaway dissidents whose life reject the confined idea of citizenship to one nation state are Chinese syndicates who evade China's state-making project and dissolve frontier ecologies and social order to pave way for a new form of unruly resource extraction and capital accumulation. I will first discuss the structural conditions that gave rise to dark Somia in contemporary current Burmese-Thai borderland through the case studies of the Shea and New City and the KK Park. I will demonstrate how such illicit enterprises have grown invincibly while weaving together various kinds of networks both within and across the border. Despite the attempt by China to crack down on crime, online fraud, and gambling in the Thailand-Myanmar border region, such effort has not been fruitful. So the rise of dark Somia. Chinese illicit capital that is currently active at the border of Thailand and frontier of Myanmar mostly fled from Chinese state control and regulation. I suggest that the proliferation of illegal economic activities operated by Chinese capital in Southeast Asia must not be viewed as an isolated phenomenon of appearance, disconnected from the growing economy of the region. The rise of this shadow economy is rather a response to changing regional and global geopolitics in which Chinese state is the key actor. Sociologist Alvin Kamba posits that China's over-accumulation crisis has resulted in the movement of two types of capital to the global south. The first type is state-backed capital that aims to impose the model of development and to expand China's economic influence into the region. Going up policy and BRI are two examples of this type of capital. The second type is flexible capital, the private capital with the primary aim to extricate itself from the restraints placed by the Chinese state. Examples of extrication-driven flexible capital include capital in offshore financial centers, money laundering in the developing world, and investments in illicit sectors such as online gambling, telecommunication, fraud business, sex work, and wildlife trade. Forceful suppression on the gambling industry, money laundering, and violence-related crime by the Chinese state, both within the country and across the border since 2015, had led many casino enterprises moving to Southeast Asian countries such as the Philippines, Cambodia, whose policies are supportive towards a gambling business. However, China's pressure on both Philippine and Cambodian governments to close down Chinese-operated gambling business have resulted in the relocation of the Chinese illicit capital to the ethnic currents control border area. Partnered with the ethnic current armed groups and supported by the Myanmar's military government, massive villages' land along the Mui River have been confiscated and turned into hubs of online gambling industries. Branding as developmental scheme, several modernization schemes where entertainment business coexists with illegal activities have been established by different Chinese investors, including the Shea New City Project, the Saisigang Industrial Zone, the Huanya International New City Project in the current Thai frontier. Before the COVID-19, the scale of illicit economy of online gambling in this area was limited to the regional network that target mainly the Chinese, both in terms of labor recruitment and customers. But since the outbreak of the pandemic, when online gambling was affected by the close down of the borders, the enterprises have switched to the scamming industry, which has expanded its sphere of operation globally. Now, friction of sovereignty. In dark Somia, what set up sharp, relatively inflexible limits to the effectiveness of the state is not the friction of terrain as Scott contains, but rather the friction of sovereignty that hinders the accessibility of the state. Let me use this story to illustrate my point. On November the 5th last year, the Tak provincial police issued an order to investigate the claim that a group of Thai police officers from the Provincial Police Regional 6 in Masot was sent across the Thai border to negotiate a raise in the bribe money with the current border guard force BGF with regard to the Chinese living in the Shea Koko area. The incident was first reported by a Thai media, Thai PBS, alongside the claim that such demand came after the Myanmar government has suspended border crossing by foreigners, except Thai citizens, following the pressure by the Chinese government to take serious measures against the Chinese-operated online scamming hub along the Myanmar-Thai border. The negotiation, however, failed miserably. Leader of the BGF, Sochitu, was so angry that he threatened to close down the natural border under the control BGF for 3 months. If border control is quintessential exercise of sovereignty, it is often played out by various actors and through various forms, including bribery, protection fee, and extortion. The above-mentioned story of friction invites scholars of social sciences to rethink the theory of sovereignty. While sovereignty has increasingly been viewed as divisible and reconfigurable, state territory can also be unbundled, while infrastructural power can be expanded across networks and beyond the territory of the state. In so doing, it both deterritorializes existing states and re-territorializes membership of political entities. As a result of such sovereignty arrangement, we are beginning to witness increasingly complex, multiple, and overlapping hierarchies of sovereignty in which political authority has been reconfigured across different functional dimensions and spatial scales. Yet, flexible management of sovereignty is also historically contingent and contextually specific, which involves not only the state, but also the interaction between state and non-state actors. In the case of the current Burmese-Thai frontier, while different modes of governing segments of the population are at play, what characterizes this zone is the constant negotiation and contestation over claims between the state and non-state actors, which contribute to what I call the friction of sovereignty. The rubbing of several forces in their everyday exercise of sovereignty that has resulted in an uneven jumble through which various actors seek to enact or assert control over borders and over the movement of money and people and sovereign right. The growing of Chinese online scamming economy in the dark zone has been made possible by taking an advantage from the friction of sovereignty, the grammar of governance, which the Chinese scamming investors are keen to learn, while the Myanmar government granted the BGF a certain form of autonomy to control over lucrative cross-border trade and taxation, and the right to collaborate with the Chinese tycoon in exchange of guarding the ethnic resistant group. The military also uses the friction of sovereignty for double dealing. The Tatmadaw might play along with China occasionally when they were pressured to eliminate the illegal gambling and online scam operations in the border area, or in some cases, they might transfer the pressure onto the BGF. At the same time, the task of the BGF is to make sure that the overlapping deal-driven sovereignty, although subject to constant fluctuation, work its best to serve all parties' benefit. In this dark zone, the ability to play into the negotiating space of governance is key to the politics of frontier accumulation of capital and the evasion from the reach of the Chinese state. It is this friction of sovereignty that brings to life the illicit movement and collaboration of scamming economy, propelled by various actors involved in the assemblage of illegal capital. So my last point here is assemblage of dark zone. One of the key characteristics of dark zone is mobility and its ability to deterritorialize and re-territorialize, which is essential for capital accumulation. Connectivity and mobility are thus important principles of the assemblage. Organizing flows of power, making inclusions and exclusions, collaborating with both similar and different kinds of network are carried out by the assemblage in order to reproduce itself. By doing so, an assemblage of crime might generate a certain kind of territory in order to hide other possible ways of assembling crime, which engenders different effects. This act of mobility entails deterritorializations or lines of flight. The mobile characteristics of crime assemblage can be found in various areas of dark Somia, which moves across the border of Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, transferring capital and labor in criminal activities from one area to the other. The crime hub in the Myanmar frontier is thus not an enclave or isolated area as often portrayed by media and academic alike. Both scam cities, Shea, and SEC and the KK Park have never been closed or static but open and provisional, constituting the relationship with other economic entities, legal or otherwise. Infrastructural development inside these two projects has been directly buttressed by cross-border connections and economy of collusion by various groups of public and private enterprises, especially in the Thai border town of Mysore. Many of the Thai enterprises have prospered from the growing of illicit economy through economic exchanges. These include cargo pier business that provide cross-border transportation of people and goods, construction material suppliers who are behind the fast-growing infrastructure building within the zone, food and goods delivery service that cater goods to customers and workers in the zone, and large-scale retail stores that supply food, drinking water, and groceries products into the zone. Furthermore, state in enterprises such as the Provincial Electricity Authority and leading internet provider firms also treated the two online scam cities as their prominent customers and earned lucrative income from them for many years before the Thai government, pressured by China, cut off the power supply and internet connection in a bid to crack down on illegal online gambling last year. So the frontier assemblage of the dark Somia also extend globally, weaving together a collection of various actors, events, discursive practice, virtuality, and allure, value and violence. All these elements are drawn into the economy of online fraud, from labor recruitment to skill training, torturing, scamming, laundering, and escaping. These heterogeneous elements coalesce and reshape the terrain while turning the frontier into what Ananya Laure calls riskscapes, the transformation of territory by certain technologies' power to manage accumulation and risk. But this contingent convergence is also by no means permanent or fixed, but subject to change and dispersed, realigned all the time. Now we come to the conclusion. So in this presentation, I have called to the attention the rise of the shadow economy and its trans-border society in the interstices of state power in contemporary Myanmar's borderland. I propose that dark Somia be viewed as one form of frontier assemblages, originating out of contestation and collusion of sovereign and territorial power that goes beyond the Lurie-Unlurie dichotomy. It is the space of multiplicity of projects and intervention, not a uniform and coherent governance, of overlapping forms of rule that changes and shifts all the time, of collaboration and evasion that allows illicit capital to flow and grow. I would like to end this talk by an interview I had with a young Thai who works as a translator for a boss who runs an online scamming company inside the KK Park. And from this quote, you probably noticed that the peculiar aspect of the dark Somia lies not only in its mobility and malleability to evade state power, but rather in the ability to reassemble and reconnect with various elements that move in and out of state licit and non-state illicit space. As a result, power relation becomes diffused and highly negotiated. Boundaries become blurred, and dark Somia proliferates beyond the interstices of the frontier. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Pinkeaw, for the presentation, and helping to, I think, push this idea that that the crime activity that we've seen is often referred to as compound crime, or this emergence of compound crime, but understanding that these connections are the ways in which this crime activity is connected to the broader economic trajectory of the region, and how this sort of nefarious economic development fits within the stories and the development trajectory of the countries in the region. I'll now hand it over to Laure to share her research.
You can go to this one. Hello, so I'm Laure. I'm a journalist for a decade based in the Thai-Myanmar border, and the story kind of fell on my lap because I was here to talk about the healthcare access of people living in these vulnerable communities with very limited access to infrastructure, to state help, and the first building appeared in the jungle, and then we were wondering what it was all about in 2017-18. And then it's a story that you don't choose, but that you have the responsibility to cover because it impacted so many people. So Kun Pinkeaw had a very compelling presentation about what are we talking about, and I want to tell you some stories from people who are living there and what are the conditions really that enable this mass scale of trafficking and scamming and money laundering in a remote rural area that was living for decades on cattle, teak wood, gold, petrol, kind of small informal trade, and suddenly we have the biggest scamming hub in the world. And what happened and what was the consequences on the people. So we look at who is the willing and unwilling actors of this industry, and especially with a focus on the local people who were kind of swept out in this industry. So just as a geographical explanation, you can see on the left side it's Myanmar, on the right side it's Thailand, and the river is the border. So the river is the border between the two countries is 2,400 kilometers, and especially this river is 300 kilometers. But the province, the main city in the province is Mesot, and on the other side, Shwekoko and Myawaddy, that are the main place where this compound are located. So on top of it, it's the main gateway of the East-West Economic Corridor, as well as the Asian Highway #1. So it's a big trade point. And you can see 2016, it's a big village. Shwekoko is a big village. There is maybe 20,000 people, something like this, much less, and one small gambling den, and that's it. And suddenly we have a city. We have a city with 150,000 people, and all this building that popped up in a few years. So this is what we saw from the Thai border, and you can see it very well, because the river is nothing. I will show you. The river is that. So in dry season, when it's not the monsoon, you can cross. You can walk over to the other side. So the picture is taken from the Thai side, and on the other side, you can see this is the kind of building where people are being trafficked and trapped to run this cyber scam. So on the other side in Myanmar. And the construction is 24 hours ongoing. Day, night, one building. Every day there is one other building. And yeah, I should have put a picture of the before where it was virgin jungle, just jungle, nothing. And suddenly we have a city with this kind of thing. So I'm focusing especially on the infrastructure and the local actors that are enabling, the enabling condition, because it's my colleagues, especially from the media industry, did an amazing job of looking at the plague of the fate of the people who were trafficked there. So we both have primary victims, the people who get trafficked on a fake job coming there, and the secondary victims, people all around the world who get scammed. In Australia, a lot too. In every day you have this in the media. It comes from here. The source of the scam is that. And so we have three different research questions. One is the fact that infrastructure that was built at the border. We are talking highways, we are talking electricity and internet, all of this, how it has been captured and used by a criminal group for their activities. And then we are looking what kind of industry, what kind of sectors is developing when such a criminal activity is coming, and how do we recruit hundreds of thousands of people in a remote area of Southeast Asia. And then the money, when is the money coming, when is the money going? So this is the border zone. It looks like that. So on the river, you have gates. This is straight gates. Gates just mean a pier. It's on the Thai side, you can lease a plot of land, and then you can operate a business. Everyone who wants to pass things to the other side will have to pay a rent to you, some commission. So in 10 years ago, we had maybe 20 gates, and they were open also to the local communities to pass under an agreement between the two countries that local people can go 30 kilometers each side. And then we had 60 gates. Every businessman started to open a gate to pass goods, and then local people were not allowed to use that anymore. So we try to show that the infrastructure that were built by development or governmental aid were captured and monopolized by criminal groups. So you can see a small timeline history of what happened in both countries that allowed that. After the coup, there was really this alliance between the ethnic armed group, the local authorities on both sides, and Chinese investors to operate these crime cities. And these crime cities, despite being in one of the most conflict-affected areas of Myanmar since the war, has never been attacked. Not a single bullet land in these cities. While all around, you have 2 airstrikes a day. So the village around are being bombed, but the cities, there is not a single bullet that goes there because every armed actor makes profit from it. So there is a deal, then the middle is never going to be touched. It's an enclave. And in Thailand, as I explained, Mae Sot became this small city, small border town, and now it's an enormous amount of cash and investment that's coming in this city. So of course, with no regulation. So of course, this has massive impact. And because it's a border area, it's the army, the Thai army, who is in charge, with a relatively limited reach from the central government. They don't know everything what's happening there in Bangkok. And then we had this booming business as a consequences from the telecommunication, energy sources, goods that were used by the other side. So with the labor, so it's all started with a land grab, because you can see on the satellite map, it was a rural area with some village and some sort of small town in the middle. And you have to push these people out to build the cities. So 14 villages from the Karen minority, which is this minority group living for hundreds of years on the eastern of Myanmar, with 6-7 million people. And they were forced at gunpoint to sell the land. It was not even a selling because it's customary law, no? So it's people didn't have a paper to show. On generation you had this land, and suddenly you are pushed out and you are given a small amount of money, and then the armed group who do this deal lease the land to criminal group, so the Yatai group. So these people, what happened to them? So you lose the land. They were mostly agricultural people. They became security guards for the very scamming compounds that were built on their own land. So they became security guard, driver, food provider, cleaner, and all this industry, hotel management, supermarkets, because we are talking 150,000 people on the other side, so you need to feed them. There is all the meat, all this thing that's coming. So they were pushed into serving the criminal industry. And also, it's a pretty traditional, half Christian, half animist community that suddenly had all this boom of prostitution, drugs, gambling, weapons coming into the society. So that made a huge generational divide between old and young people. All of this was organized by this transnational network from mainland China. So it's a Chinese and Taiwanese people, members of the criminal groups from the 90s who were dealing with telecommunication scam in the 90s. In China and Taiwan, there was a big clean-out campaign in mainland China and Taiwan in 2000. In 2010, these people moved out from China, from Taiwan to Macau to Southeast Asia. So it's the same people and the same networks, and they support with diaspora who are living in Southeast Asia for a long time. And then they can create local network in every country where you have a diaspora. So this is luxury car, this is hotels, this is minivan who are bringing trafficked people from Bangkok to the border. This is gold shop, this is restaurant. And then how the people get recruited. So there is two ways. A lot is the online. So I'm gonna tell you a story about a Filipino woman. She graduated from Manila University in digital marketing, and she's very happy to find a job on Facebook Marketplace. Okay, and it's $1,000. There is not many jobs for $1,000 in Southeast Asia for a fresh graduate. And she arrived in Bangkok, and she sent a contract. She talked to a Filipino Thai woman on the phone. She arrived in Bangkok, and then you are put in a minivan, you are driven to the border, you spend a night in the hotel, and at night you are blindfolded, put on the boat, put to the other side, and you are trafficked there. So this is one thing where it's completely fraudulent job advertisement. So there is a lot of responsibility on Facebook, on WhatsApp, on TikTok, on LinkedIn. They are everywhere, on Telegram. Every channel has fake jobs in Southeast Asia. And then the other one is people are sold by their own people. So it's in-person recruiter, both in the countries and both in Mesot, from every nationality, who are recruiting their own people based on the language, and also to save themselves. Because once you have been trafficked and trapped into this place, there is only two ways you are going out. You are paying a ransom, which is like $10,000, $15,000, according to your nationality, to get out. Or you are selling someone else to replace you on the seat. So we have people who have been sold by their own cousin who wanted to save themselves. So you have to replace or you have to pay to get out. So this is my point of victim becoming accomplice in the human trafficking. And also you have a last category, which are the models. So the models are the people who answer the video call, because a lot of this scamming happen on dating app, Ashley, Madison, Tinder, Bumble, anything. So you have a video call, and the person is usually women from Eastern Europe who answer to thousands of customers, and who will run the video call and convince the person to invest in this crypto scam. So, and then the money, it's a lot of money, as my colleague said, and it's also, I let you read maybe the theory, but the practice, I can tell you a story how easy it is to cash out money. So a lot is being made because there is no ceiling of how much money you can make. With drugs, there is a ceiling. There is a street price. There is a ceiling. With crypto, there is no ceiling. It can be as high as you want. Then a lot of it is being stolen from people in USD or in USDT. And how do you change a USDT, a crypto, into cash? Because that's what people want, the cash at the end. In Thailand, it's very easy. You have an ATM all over Bangkok where you can put your crypto USB digital wallet and you cash out baht. And in Cambodia, most of the currency is USD, so it's also a big hub to money launder to get USD, cash in USD, and then this money is putting back into property, luxury cars, casino in Dubai, in Singapore, in other companies. So I just a story. I was in this city, going to the bank with a friend for personal matter, and in front of us there is two Chinese people who ask if they can cash out the whole bank account, and the receptionist say yes, for sure, and then you get $60,000 in a bag in front of you with absolutely no check. So there is no check. There is check on some nationalities in Thailand, but it's not regulated in an harmonious way, so it's very easy to cash out. How do we respond to that? It's very difficult because also we have an ethical question, because we know that the criminal group inside these compounds are reading the news. We know that they are reading our articles, and we know that they read it and then they change their way. And then you have always the question, do you publish what you know? Because then they also know, and it gives them a way to be adaptable. So the adaptability is in terms of market. They will target other country. If one country gets very angry, they will move to other places that are not visible on satellite. So we are looking at micro cells, one condo, one flat, 3 people in there with a 10 device, or they will change the way where they traffic people. It will not be a Manila-Bangkok direct flight anymore. You go, you take a ferry, you take a bus, you take a thing. So there is no way to track again the things. They change passport. There is many countries in the world, you can just put $100,000 on the table and you get a passport. So there is many ways that they adapt, and they also formalize. So for example, you have letters who say to the company, we should not torture the people so much because it doesn't look good in the media. So it's like, because I don't know if my colleague said, but it's like when you get trafficked in this place and you have a target, if you don't hit your target, it's different with the company. Let's say $100,000 a month, you have to target someone. If you don't hit this target, you get hit yourself physically. So there is a lot of torture, a lot of mistreatment in these places. And some has been out in the New York Times, and then they said we should be careful when we hit people. It doesn't look good, so they look for formalization. The big picture, the big problem we have is that, to go back to the infrastructure, at the beginning when I look at this, I'm like, oh, I will just look at roads and bridge and river channel, but actually it's the economical, the political infrastructure that has been infiltrated by immense corruption, like my colleague shown. That's the profit that shared among the local authorities to make this happen. It's not possible to bring so much electricity and people on the other side without the complicity. So there is that. That is very difficult. In some countries, some of this criminal group present people at the local election, become candidate, become MP, so it's like when they are in the judiciary and political system, how do you stop that? So this is the challenge we want to talk about, and then we can see now Dubai is a big thing. A lot of jobs now move to Dubai because when there is one crackdown in one place, it just moves to the other one. And so I didn't put it there, but. Here you can see this was an article. This one was an article. I arrived in Australia for the first time 2 days ago. I opened the newspaper and there is ABC News. And this is ABC News 2 days ago. And this is Anne, who lost $46,000 in a bid sharing scam. So What I mean is that there is other article who show link between the Isle of Man in Britain, in the UK, because the Isle of Man has a very nice tax-free scheme arrangement. So every place with some tax-free scheme arrangement and an airport and some infrastructure and some weak law enforcement is at risk of becoming a new hub. Thank you.
Thank you, Laure, for sharing the detailed information and observation that you collect in the work that you do. And it really is investigative journalists, both Southeast Asian nationals and then others that have supported the incredible information that we've been able to collect and to be able to tell the stories about this industry and the people that it affects along the way. I'll hand it over now to Lucia, who from ASEAN-Act. Some of you may have caught the panel she gave this morning, but to lead us through what is being done and what can be what we can try and do to address this issue and what's going on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you to the previous speakers and panelists. I think, Professor Pinkeaw, your analysis of the political economy factors that really make border areas very ripe for illicit and criminal markets is incredibly important to acknowledge. And Laure, your very granular and contextual, nuanced analysis of what's happening on the Thai-Myanmar border is in many ways a microcosm for what is happening in various pockets across Southeast Asia. And I think it's really critical to start with the structural factors because there's been a lot of analysis in the media, a lot of discussions in regional meetings about this being a new form of trafficking, about this taking us by surprise, about this being a completely new illicit criminal market. And I think when we actually look at the governance factors and the enabling environment, we see that in fact it's classic trafficking. It is the recruitment, the transfer, the harbouring of individuals through deception or force or coercion into a situation of exploitation. And the things that have made the enabling environment ripe for other kinds of trafficking in Southeast Asia, whether that's labour trafficking, sex trafficking, trafficking for forced marriage or forced criminality, are exactly the same factors that have proliferated trafficking into online scamming. The difference, I think, is that it's impacting us here in Australia. It's impacting people in Europe. It's impacting people in America. There are very large amounts of money taken from the formal financial system as a result of this pattern. So this particular pattern of trafficking in persons, if there is a silver lining, and, you know, of course, the situation is really bleak, the silver lining, I guess, is that it has focused the region and the world's attention on governance in Southeast Asia and the specific factors that enable transnational organised crime. So I think it's important to acknowledge the newness, to acknowledge the speed with which these particular operations have expanded and the specific set of circumstances that led to trafficking for forced criminality, but also to keep very front of mind that these weak governance issues have always existed and that these are exactly the same issues that proliferate other types of exploitation. So just building off what the previous speakers have said, there were some very specific factors that combined to result in the proliferation of online scamming centres or compound crime across the region. In addition to the factors that have been mentioned by the previous speakers, some of those political economy factors, during COVID-19, we also saw large numbers of borders being closed, of course, casinos being closed, legitimate businesses needing to resort to more illegitimate forms of making money. The proliferation of cryptocurrencies really has exploded in the last 2 years. We saw Chinese criminal networks very much connecting with and integrating into local criminal networks. And I think a lot of the analysis can sort of say, well, the problem is over there. It's external actors coming into our region. But we know that these actors wouldn't be able to operate without local complicity of officials, but without also convergence with criminal gangs and networks operating quite freely and with a lot of impunity in Southeast Asia. The scamming psychology was perfected. When we first started hearing about trafficking for forced criminality, there was a certain set of skill sets that you needed to be a good scammer. Now you can download all of that on the internet. Basically, you're copying and pasting. You don't need to speak the same language as the person that you're trying to scam. That all happens for you. So the skill set has very much become basic IT skills, and the playbook itself has been perfected. It's a cheap, it's a low violent, it's a very easy way and a very profitable way for criminals to make money. We also saw a large pool of young migrant workers available, particularly during COVID-19, particularly graduates coming out of university looking for jobs. So this in many ways created the perfect storm for trafficking into compound crime. We've spoken, of course, about some of the other systemic factors, conflict in Myanmar, porous borders, and also the ability to launder proceeds of crime into the formal financial system. We know now that there are at least 10 professional money laundering services operating in Southeast Asia. They are all Chinese-owned businesses, but effectively it's literally as easy as taking your laundry to the laundromat. Your money comes from criminal proceedings and comes out clean and enters the formal financial system. So COVID-19 really brought a lot of criminal activity to a halt, which arguably was a good thing, but of course organised crime groups needed to find a new way of making money. There were a lot of Chinese nationals that returned home from the Mekong sub-region in 2021, and this created a large labour gap and the need really to look at diverse ways, diversifying your income, as any good business operator does. There was, of course, an increase in online activity with our lives, our workplaces, our communities shifting online. There was also law enforcement distractions. So many law enforcement authorities in Southeast Asia were consumed by enforcing COVID-19 lockdowns, by doing vaccination campaigns. And during that time, we saw very little effort to combat transnational organised crime. Effectively, criminal groups then identified a very freely available labour source of trafficked, young, educated, media savvy. They were multilingual at the time, they no longer need to be. Firstly from China, then from Southeast Asia, and now from the entire globe. So these are young individuals looking for jobs that are slightly better paid than the opportunities they might have at home. They sign 6-month contracts thinking that they are going into legitimate call centre work, legitimate hotel work, legitimate business work. They're often interviewed, sometimes once, sometimes twice. It's often very difficult to distinguish a real job ad from a false job ad on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on other forms of social media like TikTok. And so I guess this has really changed the typical victim of trafficking that we think about, that we were talking about earlier this morning. Normally it's a powerless woman, a young child. These are educated and primarily young men. And not only have they not been recruited in such large numbers, there's very much a bias around who constitutes an ideal victim of trafficking. Just to give you a sense of where they're coming from, this is truly a global problem. We have an estimated 300,000 plus people. This is a conservative estimate and becomes out of date very quickly, from at least 60 countries from around the world. So you can see a global map there, coming from Africa, coming from South Asia, coming from Europe, coming from conflict-affected areas such as Ukraine and Russia. Large numbers of people flocking into the region for this purpose. A satellite image of the actual compounds themselves, you can see how well organised and professionalised they are now. Typically, different groups and nationalities are segregated and working by their different nationality. Indonesians, Vietnamese, work labourers from Malaysia, even Singapore. You can see that these compounds are guarded, and typically they're guarded by private security forces, which criminal or operatives engage in because they're making large profits. The cost of hiring private security is just part of doing business. But typically these private security guards are also working very closely with local law enforcement. So we see on the Thai-Myanmar border large involvement of the Royal Thai Police in Bok Gao, in the Special Economic Zone in Laos. We see that the Lao police are very much complicit. And of course, in Cambodia, the government has been implemented right up to the highest levels. Criminal actors. So there are varied criminal actors, and the previous speakers touched on some of these really interesting roles that people are playing. I want to highlight particularly this concept of a role shifter. And a role shifter is a term that we've coined to describe the kinds of elites that play multiple roles. For example, you may have a Chinese national who is at large from China, fleeing prosecution in China for a crime committed previously, they have protection in Cambodia. They may have purchased Cambodian citizenship. They may also be offered a position in a planning ministry. They may also be offered a senator position. So these people are politicians, they're criminals, and they're business elites. And they shift roles on a daily basis depending on what the demands of their industry are. So these kind of role shifters are really critical in infiltrating local political systems. We also saw in the Philippines, I'm sure many of you have followed the very mysterious story of Alice Gao, who she really is, what she's really there for. She would be another person we would describe as a role shifter. Corrupt officials, this wouldn't happen without corruption, and of course addressing corruption and complicity is key to responses. Recruitment networks, I think it is important to acknowledge that a lot of this recruitment is happening online, but not always. As Laure said, if there are local communities and there are no other legitimate job opportunities in these communities, people are being recruited locally. People are being recruited by cousins, by local community members. IT support, I mean, pretty much all you need is an internet connection to build a compound crime centre. You need a stable telecommunications network. They are consuming fairly large amounts of power, and there are companies in Thailand that have now started to shut down their services where they know they are being used in border areas in Myanmar. But as we've spoken about, these compounds and the operators are very agile, so they will move very freely to, if infrastructure services are shut down in one area, they will easily reappear in another part of the region. The profits, so Nathan gave an estimate. There are lots of numbers flying around and there's no need to remember these numbers other than that's a lot of money, and we should be caring about the loss to the economy in a very strained kind of economic situation that we're all facing. But just to say that this is a very profitable way of making money and has proven to be more profitable than other forms of transnational organised crime. It does continue to morph and adapt, and I think that's because any responses that have come from authorities have really tackled individual operating environments or operations, not crippled their ability to operate. So there's a slight difference there. There have been raids, there have been rescues, there have been arrests, there have been deportations, targeting KK Park, for example, targeting King's Roman in Laure, targeting scamming centres in Sihanoukville, but we haven't seen a concerted attempt to cripple the criminal networks, to actually unravel the organised crime network that is sustaining this. So I think this is why the criminal networks have been able to continue to move and operate. And of course, there are other areas of weak governance beyond the region that, that criminal actors can move to. They rely on the ability to move. So in summary, before we get on to responses, we had a perfect storm with technological advances, blurred lines between crime and the private sector, and we often see that these shell companies are maybe linked to legitimate companies. It's very difficult to detect which companies are legitimate businesses and which companies are actually enabling transnational organised crime. And corruption and weak governance, which is, of course, a consistent binding constraint across the region. To point out the multifaceted harms, and I think the previous speakers have already done a much better job than me, because you are on the ground observing the very real impacts to communities. But I guess just to say that there is no way of escaping the multifaceted impacts. If there is a casino, say in King's Roman, in Bot Gao, there's a huge environmental impact. There's a huge impact on social cohesion. There's a huge threat to peace and security. So all of these harms are interlinked. So what is happening? What are we doing about this incredibly bleak picture that we have all painted, really, as the three speakers? I think our traditional responses to trafficking have really been challenged through this new trend. Not because this is a different form of trafficking, but because we've never really tried to address trafficking effectively. And this is something that in scale, in numbers, in impact, is challenging what has only ever been a handful of cases coming through the courts. So there's little or no proactive investigation in the countries of destination. And by that, we mean Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, the Philippines. There has been more proactive action, but there's also a concern that these operations will morph and become common through other business operation centres. as many of these victims are foreign, they're actually not really given protection and support in the countries in which they're discovered. If they are rescued, the best they might be offered is a consular flight home. There have been very few formal identification of scamming victims as victims of trafficking. And a big reason for this is these victims of trafficking have committed crime. So it is somewhat counterintuitive for police, particularly at the local level, to know that someone has been forced to commit a crime, but actually identify them as a victim and protect them as such. Once you are in a protection pathway, you are likely to be entitled to services and support and reintegration. The minute you go down a prosecution pathway, it's very difficult to come out of that. So we see largely a criminalisation of the scamming workforce, when in reality there's a whole spectrum of practice happening within those scamming compounds. No doubt there are perpetrators, no doubt there are managers, there are formal employment structures, there are HR people recruiting more people. But for the large majority, the people that have been deceived, are not receiving any wages, are being tortured, are being subject to physical or psychological violence, are being sold into sex slavery, are not being identified as victims of trafficking. There's also limited understanding of digital evidence and how to use that in criminal justice proceedings, which is a very technical topic for another day. So what has ASEAN done? This has affected all 10 ASEAN member states to different degrees, but in many ways all have been impacted, from Singapore in terms of the actual scamming and the financial losses to countries like Indonesia and Philippines, where many victims have been recruited into compound crime. There is political will and there is discussion at the ASEAN regional level about what to do with this form of trafficking. And during Indonesia's Laure's chair, there was an ASEAN Leaders Declaration on combating trafficking caused by the abuse of technology. Some governments have been more proactive, and Indonesia has been one of those governments, putting a lot of pressure on Cambodia. The Philippines has banned pogo operations in an attempt to address the compound crime happening within its own borders. It has identified large numbers of victims. However, by and large, those victims have not received access to compensation, restitution, protection and support. As I mentioned, consular responses have typically been the minimum that they've been entitled to. Some new approaches have been trialled. So we've seen the US government put sanctions on a Chinese national who is also a Cambodian senator, who is known for his role in facilitating large amounts of compound crime in Cambodia. The UK have also applied human rights-based sanctions to Indonesia in association with trafficking for online scamming. These are interesting tools, you know, they are somewhat blunt tools, but at least they do send a very strong message to individuals within that system that this behaviour and the criminality associated is not being tolerated by countries. Australia definitely, through our program, has been working a lot more with and through ASEAN, so trying to support and get a group of like-minded actors that want to fix the problem, noting that there are many that don't. So it's a very contested space, and I think when you do gather actors together, it's really important to look at who is complicit, who's actually benefiting, who has an interest in fixing the problem. So really what we've done is facilitate a whole lot of policy dialogues with countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, countries that have a stronger interest in fixing the problem, and brought them together with civil society, with investigative journalists and with the private sector. And I do agree with Nathan that investigative journalists have been critical in building the evidence base in relation to transnational crime in the Mekong, and that their protection and their right to continue to do their free and independent work is incredibly important as part of our response. We have encouraged bilateral cooperation between law enforcement authorities in the region, particularly Thailand and Cambodia, and Thailand and Laos. Thailand is very much a transit country where victims are being transported into the countries of destination, being Thailand and Cambodia. Thailand, not all, we have a lot of complicity at local level, but at national level there is concern, there is reputational damage for Thailand in being known to be a transit country and a facilitator of this crime. So there is an effort from police, law enforcement and even prosecutors to be cooperating more with Cambodia and Laos, countries with a lot less capacity to actually respond to crime on this scale. We've conducted research, including with the Global Initiative for Transnational Organised Crime, which should be coming out shortly, with legal support for women and children, a Cambodian NGO who've documented the experiences of victims in compound crime. That's been presented to the government in policy dialogue. And we think has made a contribution to Cambodia at least acknowledging the problem. 18 months ago, we were probably in a situation where none of the governments in this region acknowledged that they had a trafficking problem. We have seen some admission, some awareness, some ability to engage and share information with other authorities in the region. And also supporting ASEAN processes. So that declaration, we provided technical assistance to draft that. Now, of course, the more difficult challenge is to support countries to implement it. And just finally, what more can be done? I think there's so much more that needs to be done, and it is. It's a real privilege, actually, to be able to talk to members of the Australian aid community and members that work in this region about raising the urgency, I think, of this issue. We have been talking about it for the last couple of years, but I think by and large, there isn't a large awareness about how bad it is and how entrenched these criminal networks are, not only in informal systems in Southeast Asia, but also in government systems. So we need to increase the political will, of course, to address the problem, particularly corruption and complicity in border areas like Mesot. We definitely need to develop clearer victim identification guidelines for this particular form of trafficking, because frontliners are saying that we don't know who the victims are from who the criminals are. I think it's clear if you do work in trafficking, how to identify victims from perpetrators, but we can also see the complexity of this issue and that more guidance is needed for anyone that might be encountering a victim coming out of this compound crime. Facilitating formal and informal cooperation through ASEAN and through other mechanisms continues to be a focus. There's not a lot of cooperation that happens currently on trafficking cases, but typically you will find a victim in one country, the digital evidence in another country, the perpetrator in a third country, and maybe the assets in a fourth country. So of course we need to enhance both formal and informal cooperation. The support for civil society and NGOs remains really pressing, and if we were going to do anything, I would say we need to support civil society on the ground who are supporting victims, who are advocating for better protections, who are working very closely with local communities and local access to try to address some of those multifaceted harms that I mentioned. We need more proactive investigation. So we know that trafficking attempts have been fairly minimal across the globe, really, but where we are good is at following the money. And there is a very strong correlation between money laundering as a predicate offence for trafficking in persons. So using the civil legal frameworks that we have, using structures like the FATF, using the organisational institutional arrangements that are in place for countering illicit financial flows actually provides a lot of scope to address this form of organised crime. And just on the other side there, I want to highlight the really important role of the private sector. Data sharing and information, everything from payment records to recruitment ads to signal sharing. Some of this is happening across the private sector, but it is not consistent and it's not industry-wide. Government doesn't require this. There are particular regulations in governments that actually hinder information sharing, but particularly the financial sector, including cryptocurrency providers, know that they need to be doing more to prevent and address this crime, have a lot of data that they want to share with government. And I think we need to get better in bringing government and financial sector together to think about what kind of information needs to be shared. We also need to be increasing the know your customer due diligence checks that the financial sector is responsible for to prevent illicit financial flows entering into the formal system. Telecoms and service providers, so some action has happened in Thailand, but we know in many other parts of the region there are telecoms and internet providers that are still not actively using the data that they have. Airlines and other transport providers, as Laure said, and I think Professor Pinkeaw said this too, this whole pattern and phenomenon relies on mobility. So there is a role, I think, for the transport sector in providing information, in looking at who booked a ticket, did that person travel, was it another person that travelled? There's a whole lot of cross-checking that we can be doing with airlines as well. And finally, just to say that I think we need industry-wide responses. There's no point, Meta committing to standards if their competitors like Google or TikTok are not going to do the same thing. So one thing that we are supporting through ASEAN Act is in cross-industry working groups to develop common standards on how to respond and prevent transnational organised crime linked to trafficking into online scamming. I will leave it there. It's a really complex picture, and programming in this area has to be very incremental and it has to be very modest, and I think it has to be very much based on local entry points that we find when we do find them. So really appreciate our academics and our journalists that keep up the evidence base that really help us make better programming decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia. And thank you to I think all the panel for helping for this real deep dive into what has become a wicked, complex issue that has sort of taken Southeast Asia by storm in recent years. I think, and not just the crime and the criminal elements that are coming through around, obviously, trafficking, scamming, and corruption, but how it intersects with the systems in these countries, and whether that's the political systems and issues around weak governance or poor governance, the development challenges in which these areas, in the areas in which these scams have been established, and how do you go about thinking about a more equitable or fair or less legal form of development, which is taking over this area, and then obviously the links with the systemic and conceptual ideas and problems that exist in these regions. So we have 20 minutes. That's plenty of time for questions. Maybe I'll take 2 to start with, and then we can end to the panel. So I think right at the back.
Hello, I'm Stephen Howes from here at the Development Policy Centre. Thank you. That was really interesting. I learned a lot. I'm sorry if I missed it, but I just want to ask about the role of China in terms of response. Seems like a lot of the victims are Chinese, a lot of the perpetrators are Chinese. It must be a big issue in China, a big issue in bilateral relationships. So what is China doing to solve this problem?
Who would like to?
We'll take one more question.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this very complex issue and a scary one as well. And you guys are very brave talking about this stuff among all those criminal groups. But what I wanted to ask is the role of the private sectors particularly, and is there any challenge or connection between these criminal groups, scammers and gamblers with the private sectors? Because usually in this sort of context, private sectors gain more benefit from dealing or businessing with these people.
Well, I think China is only interested in its citizens. So what happened in the past year is there was a kind of tri-party police collaboration that China imposed into this Mekong region. So there was a collaboration between Thai police, Myanmar police, Laos police, and they're trying to, Chinese state has a list of all the criminal syndicates. So they pass on the list to the Thai police, to the immigration police at the border, to sort of, prevent the flows or the mobility of these people across the border. So there were several operations along the border. There were a kind of arrest of the key actors in the company. So what the BJF trying to sort of negotiate is to send all these people to China, right? And they missions completed, done, and then they took off. So that's all they care about. I don't think that China has an interest in sort of solving this so-called criminal network, the global criminal network. I might be wrong, but that's what happened on the ground.
I would just add that, as Pinkeaw said, they are interested by their own citizen being victim and criminal, but also we should remember that all this scamming industry at the beginning was almost exclusively Chinese victims being trafficked, targeting other Chinese citizens. So the first victims of all of that were Chinese people. And then China, what they did is that they said, we don't want all this loss of money in Chinese citizens, because this then become a ground for social dissatisfaction. So if so many people in your country lose money and the government does nothing, at one point there is some anger. So as said, basically how I see it is that there was a deal with criminal groups that despite this small crackdown, it's still going on very well. So the markets change because of technology, because of AI, because of very good translation software. Now anyone from any nationality can scam anyone else from any nationality. So it's basically, we stopped scamming the Chinese people, but the rest of the world is fine. So the infrastructure is in place and the target has changed. Maybe you know more, but I think we should talk also a bit about how this places, how this, as you know, all this map that was shown by my colleagues, have an uncanny similarity with the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative in 2010, in 2014, identify some place for highways, for infrastructure, and somehow a lot of these places are around there. So there is something there. And we also know that private sector doesn't mean much in China. So I will leave it there.
That's so true. I might just add, I do very much largely agree that China has no interest in seriously and systemically cracking down on organised crime. I think it is a mixed picture, though, in terms of reputation. China is somewhat concerned about the reputation that it is building for causing organised crime across the Mekong. And to that end, there has been some pretty serious law enforcement crackdowns in Myanmar, but also in Botgao, in Laos. I think what's interesting is this idea of sovereignty, Professor Pinkeaw, where there is no sense of cooperation with the Lao authorities or needing to ask permission because it is a special economic zone with a 99-year lease to a Chinese business person. Chinese authorities come into this region freely, and certain parts of the special economic zone remain closed now because of this particular very unilateral law enforcement operation. Secondly, there is no sense of a human rights-based approach being pursued by China. So when it comes to trafficking in persons, we may want to share information and cooperate with China in relation to serious organised criminals. When it comes to victims of trafficking, they are, without exception, punished for the scamming that they do. So when they return to China, whether they're deported or they return voluntarily, they will likely face prosecution when they return. Finally, just to mention, there is a forum called the Commit Forum, which is the only regional structure on countering trafficking that China is formally a part of. It is the 5 countries of the Mekong plus China, and it's facilitated and supported by UNODP, IOM, and our program. They will be meeting in China next week, the ministerial level meeting. They will be discussing trafficking into online scamming. They will be discussing victim identification and cooperation in terms of a transnational referral mechanism. So these are always really interesting insights. Even if China doesn't share much, we get a better sense of how they are viewing the issue of trafficking, viewing their sense of responsibility in either helping or hindering the responses. I think it's very incremental, but I think it's important to continue to engage China through these forums, because the alternative is they will act unilaterally or they will act through their alternative view of security through the Global Security Initiative, which, as you all know, is the alternative sort of security paradigm similar to Belt and Road, but focused on security, which engages many countries in the ASEAN region and beyond on very alternative approaches to state-based security. Private sector or another comment?
I'd like to add a little bit. China might have some kind of ulterior motive too, that, you know, this area might be able to sort of like clean it up. Because before Shea was originated, in the beginning, the owner of the companies, Sir Chiang and other colleagues always claim that this area part of BRI. And China never refused that, this is not a part of BRI. And what happened now in the, Golden Triangle SEC and also Shea is that, you hand out all these criminals, and then you continue to do the business, you know, in order to brush up, to clean up the image. So that's a kind of, you know, ulterior motive here for China as a, yeah.
Wonderful you start speaking about this, because it's I visited the Golden Triangle in Laos, Special Economic Zone, 2-3 months ago. And what was really interesting is that we can see that on the Thai Myanmar, KK Park, these compounds, it's really horrifying from everything, from the architecture to the logistic to everything. But when you go to the Golden Triangle in Laos, which is much more recent, which is maybe 2 years ago, where it's really 6 months ago, it's really operating. So it's the new wave. And it's like family oriented. You have condo with playgrounds, you have a museum, you have a garden, you arrive and you have a banner, let's have an anti-drug marathon. While all this was built on drug money, and it's incredible. So it's like really this, what we were saying, the formalization and the cleaning up. It's like, we look bad, let's look better. But the scam, then I speak to local people who are always the ground workers. It's always Laotian, Burmese people. So I asked them, it's like, is this really a nice family park, or are we talking about the same thing than in other compounds? And they said, oh yeah, it's just behind. It's just hide it behind. But the front, it's like Hollywood. The front is nice. You have a garden and a marathon, and then the people are traffic in the back with a better sound system, so you don't hear the scream, I guess. So it's like that. So it's the one that look good might be, as Kun Pinkeaw said, a foothold, a setting for Chinese investment, for Chinese diaspora, because if it looks better, it can become anything. It can, and so in Laos, there is a huge project also of agriculture. So a lot have been built, boats around the hills, and it wants to be farmed. So it's actually wants to become a self-sustaining system where the people who will live there will also be fed by there, and then you don't need the other country, you don't need the supermarket from across the border to feed these people. So I think they are looking for self-sustenance in any aspect, in the food, in the energy. We see all this Starlink, thank you Starlink. With Starlink you can operate a scamming in the middle of jungle everywhere, and now they are building generator the size of this room that can, you don't need electricity from the state cable anymore. So I think we are witnessing the beginning of a self-sustained stronghold that are built on crime money, and that will become maybe something else.
You touched on it, but did any of you want to say more just on the role of the private sector?
I think it's a really good question. I think that tech companies, financial service providers, so there's the formal financial sector and then the sort of more informal financial sector, particularly cryptocurrency markets. I think the tech companies and the formal financial sector are concerned about their reputation in this area. I don't think they're formally complicit, but it's more inaction really is enabling and sustaining this criminal activity. Meta, for example, is facing a range of counter-trafficking charges in the US at the moment. It is linked to sexual exploitation, but it may only be a matter of time before someone actually pursues Meta as a legal person in facilitating trafficking in persons. There is that provision in most trafficking in persons legislation, but it really hasn't been tested or used very often. So I think in terms of the formal financial sector, Australian banks, for example, they're very worried about customers being scammed. I think a lot of the private sector focus has been on the second set of victims. So the scamming, the people who have lost all their financial savings in one transaction, less so on the human trafficking and facilitating human trafficking. And I think this is where attentions really need to focus not just on online scamming, but on labour trafficking as well. The private sector, by being by not responding is really complicit in this system of exploitation. And as Laure said, you know, a lot of these Chinese businesses are partially licit, partially illicit. A lot of Chinese banks have been established primarily to money launder, but they may also have a customer-facing, more legitimate business. So it is very difficult. It's the kind of the grey business that you will find very common across the Mekong, and a lot of those are Chinese-owned and operated as well. So it's a difficult question to answer concretely. I think, like political actors, there are some that want to fix the problem, and there are others that are currently profiting from the problem. Very difficult.
We have about 5 more minutes, so if there's any more questions, take them. Yep, please. Oh, yes. Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, Savannara. I'm from Cambodia, so I'm pretty familiar with all the 3 presenters presented. I'm sorry, I went out for 5 minutes after Lucia finished your presentation, and then I came back. You were talking about China. I don't know if the question I'm about to ask was already asked, but I want to know about the position of Chinese government, because if you look at Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, I think China has very strong leverage on those 3 countries, and I think go back to 2019. The Cambodian government put a ban on online casino, and I think you know that because it was pressure from Chinese government. So I don't know if the Chinese government see themselves as like what kind of actor they want to be, or they have, like you mentioned, political will. Do they want to do something about this, or they want, you know? I mean, yes. So, but my question is addressed to all the 3 presenters. Thank you.
And you're right, we did have a sort of a question about that already, but I think if there's any additional points you want to add around the role of China and how they're, I guess, trying to protect their own citizens from this, we can come to it. But there's another question up here as well.
Actually, maybe I'm not asking question because he's my boss. I just want to add more point related to, you know, in this context of scamming issues, there are 2 types of victims, right? The first one is the individual who are being scammed and losing money. And the other one is the individual that being deceived, being lured, being manipulated to work in a scamming compound as a scam operators. So these are, on the second one, the scam operators are, you know, largely being overlooked, you know, and many of the criminal justice agency, especially law enforcers, are always like very often, you know, just instead criminalizing them rather than giving them access to identification. So at this stage, maybe one point that has been forgotten by Lucia is that ASEAN Act is at the moment also working with the ASEAN sectoral body, which is SOMTICIS, and our ministerial meeting on trans-organized crime, and ICHAR, the ASEAN Commission on Human Rights, to develop what we call the non-punishment guideline. Because if you look at the ASEAN Convention, Article 14, paragraph 7, the convention has indicated very clearly that victims of trafficking shouldn't be criminally or administratively punished, or, you know, because of the trafficking consequences that they have faced, even when unlawful activity has been conducted by them, as long as the unlawful activity is linked to their trafficking context. So therefore, we are now unpacking this, you know, into the guideline with the hope that this could guiding the ASEAN member states practitioner to look at to what extent in practical they can actually implement this non-punishment principle. But I know these are quite advanced in ASEAN, to be honest, and I'm curious, you know, because in Australia, even you don't even recognize this non-punishment principle, and probably in some other part of the region. So this is something that is ongoing, and these are very timely, very important principles to be implemented when it comes to forced criminality of trafficking in the context of scamming. Thank you.
No, thank you. Maybe I'll just offer a last opportunity for final comments from our panel. We're at time, but last 30 seconds if you'd like to take it, and then we'll wrap it up.
I will just answer to your question in a sum up with China, because we did talk about it, but what we can sum up, and I'm sure you know already a lot about it, I would say as long as it doesn't target Chinese people, the scamming, and if it's not too unruly, like in Sihanoukville or like in some places in Cambodia where we had a really bad criminal situation, we shoot out in the streets. So if it doesn't go to that, if it's pretty clean, and if it doesn't target Chinese people, actually, it's a foothold for investment, because you build cities that be owned by Chinese businessmen, where they have enough money now to build their own infrastructure, and these cities can be used for anything. So I think that it's and as we said, the flow between licit and illicit money is very blurry. So even if it's illicit money, the source of how you build your generator, then you can use your generator for anything else. So it's useful for any kind of public investment.
Final comment? I actually have the kind of, disappointment with the private sector. And if I want to add is that, especially in the Thai case, the Thai Financial Institute take a very, very zero role on this issue. I mean, the bottom line question is that how come that our bank account or our phone numbers leaks out to this criminal gang, and how come that the money get out of our bank account without being blocked or being, stopped? So this kind of flows and mobility is a key kind of factor that allow these criminal activities to be able to, to grow. But after all these telecom companies and, private sector, bank institute in particular has done totally nothing in terms of investment in technology that can prevent this flow. We have seen nothing so far over the past 5 or 6 years. So, yeah.
Thanks, Professor Pinkeaw. I think it is very nascent. There's been a lot of talk, but little action so far, I'd agree. I guess my final reflection is that it is fantastic actually to have a programming response, to have a program which is flexible enough, funded by DFAT, which allows us to work at that ASEAN regional level, as Butneril said, work on the human rights-based approaches to these issues, to work with individual government actors, to work with civil society and with private sector, and then most importantly, to bring those together. This is a really complex, multifaceted issue, and it's definitely not something that a government alone can solve or a civil society actor alone can solve. So we are hopeful that through these ongoing dialogues of actors that care, we can come up with some small iterative solutions, whether it is signal sharing, whether it is know your customer due diligence, whether it is information sharing between tech companies and law enforcement, that there may be a bigger picture, particularly around data and sharing of data that can be generated that will help us prevent and address this current pattern. Thank you.
And thank you all to our panelists and to you for allowing us to steal a couple of minutes of your time. We'll be around, obviously, after the panel if you've got questions that you want to come and talk to us about. I think there's an important conversation going on here, so let's continue that into the break. Thank you all.